So I'll start with saying that indeed since August of last year, me as well as many other colleagues, Belarusians, not only Belarusians, as researchers and as citizens, we all have been involved in one way or another into the situation emotionally, but also as researchers. And I have been, as already Maxim mentioned, I have published, thanks to Anton and Maxim and other Polish colleagues, I have published a series of articles. In brief, they can be divided into two major strands or two major probably lines of my research. One of them is related to the question of authoritarianism and patriarchy. And you all know, of course, what role did women play in the development of Belarusian political situation and Belarusian evolution. But as a scholar, I'm interested not only in the way how the events were developed and in which ways women were mobilized into this dynamics. For me, as a gender scholar, it's also interesting to analyze how the contemporary, the current developments are related to the Soviet order and the gender under previous forms of authoritarianism. And the second trend, the second strand or the second line of my research is that what we are going to discuss today, it is about analog dictatorship, digital multitude, and how the technologies, what role do technologies play in the political revolution, in the political development in Belarus. And that's why I have opened this slide because I'm not sure, of course, that I will be able to go through all of these questions, but some of these points were presented in the articles which Maxim mentioned, such as, for instance, on Belarusian partisans in the cyber age, or the last part on digital multitude. And I probably will focus today on the questions of ideologies and technologies. I think it's a pretty important issue in contemporary Belarusian context. What I would like to start with, we, of course, we see that the protests in Belarus that started last summer, actually, of course, for many, the beginning of all events, the beginning of the entire story was not in August, but much earlier, since May, at least since the beginning of the electoral campaign. But of course, the proper protest movement developed and started to and became really strong after the election day. By now, when 9 months passed, many of us feel really, I wouldn't say depressed. I think I still believe that the sense of historical optimism prevails, and we understand that that what we are observing now, or what is going on now, it's the agony of the regime. It's almost impossible to look at it differently if to follow this absurd news from the absurd reality of the regime. But still, it might also seem that on the media surface that Belarusians who are not seen or who are not present on the streets, it might seem that they have transformed into the silent majority. We all understand why it happens, due to the unprecedented scale of physical and psychological violence executed by the regime, and during last months it only strengthened. We understand that there is a growing disobedience even in this absurd reality, but as I said, the political repressions indeed are just enormous. People get detained and sentenced for pretty innocent comments in social media, for wearing the trousers or coats of wrong colors, for giving interviews for the banned media, for just working on their own day in their own place, and even, as you probably know, even for just being subscribed to the prohibited Telegram channels. So that what is going on now in Belarus, for a distant observer, might look rather like a literary fiction in the genre of the theater of absurd. And these events might become, in the future, probably the ground for the synopsis on dystopian genre. But unfortunately, for many Belarusians, that what is happening now has become the norm of life. I mean, of course, taken as a quotation marks, because no one is ready to accept it as a norm of life. As the dictatorship made it almost intolerable or unbearable for the vast majority of Belarusian citizens. One more probably remark concerning this gloomy reality of contemporary of current situation in Belarus, you probably know that there is a long list of books that can help to understand Belarusian situation, and you can easily guess that among the most popular and the most popular books, there are, of course, Orwell's 1984 and Archipelago Gulag by Solzhenitsyn. And the reason why I mentioned here Orwell seems to me quite important, because indeed, if to read the news from Belarusian media, alternative and the state, and then to look through the slides, of course, we can find just incredible parallels. And here you can see two quotes. One of them is from the book which I find very useful for the analysis of how the society of control works. You know, of course, that there is an entire tradition that developed in the last 30, 40 years on the societies of discipline and societies of control. But many of those ideas developed by Michel Foucault and David Lyon and Marc Andreevich, Gilles Deleuze and Maurizio Zarato, they have been developed not on the experience of authoritarian regimes, but they have been described in most as relation between the power regime and the techniques of control and the surveillance as well, and the technologies in a completely different context. But now, when we look to what is going on now in Belarus, we suddenly discover how many proximities and how many parallels can be found in the, and actually to which even extent the techniques and the technologies of deprivation applied or employed by the societies of control, how they are all relevant to Belarusian experience. So it's not about, let's say, the psychology of the dictator. It's more about the structures and the power relations that produce a very particular order, including, of course, the order of surveillance and discipline. And here is a quote from the famous text by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, Multitude, War and Democracy in the Age of Empire, in which this a special chapter in the very beginning of the book, which is dedicated to biopower. And again, I find it also interesting that, speaking of Belarusian situation in the context of the technological regimes that power employs, we should think, of course, not only of the old and new information and communication technologies, but also the way how information technologies are interact, or how they simultaneously how they are used and juxtaposed to biotechnologies, and that's the fact that the Belarusian crisis has started and developed in the context of pandemic, under the conditions of pandemic, of course, provides a very specific material for future analysis of how this dictatorship, how this authoritarian regime, what kind of biopower had it used. And since what we are reading now about the Belarusian situation has very much to do with the, indeed, with it does have already the features of junta, and military, very militarized authoritarian system, and the question of biopower has direct relation to the issue of tortures. So here, Antonio Negri and Michael Hart note that biopower wields not just the power of mass destruction of life, such as that threatened by nuclear weapons, but also the individualized violence. When individualized in its extreme form, biopower becomes torture. Such an individualized exercise of power is a central element in the society of control in Orwell's 1984. And here is a quote from Orwell, which also I think describes very well or is relevant for understanding this particular historical moment and this particular circumstances in which Belarusians live now. Here is the quote: "How does one man assert his power over another?" Winston thought. "By making him suffer," he said. "Exactly, by making him suffer. Obedience is not enough." I'm not sure that Lukashenko and his clique, let's say his junta, is actually familiar with Orwell's text, but that what's going on is clearly a sign that it's not just enough, obedience is not enough. People should suffer according to this regime. Later on, I will show one of the examples of how the tortures became not only the norm of this life under the last, I hope, months of the last days of dictatorship, but also there is a new dimension that has to do with the union between methods of between tortures and the methods that are used by the police and the work of media as ideological state apparatus. And again, here I wouldn't say that it's something particularly new, something really novel, or a kind of extraordinary in relation to the authoritarian regimes, but given that we are living in the digital age and many things are really, many things have become much easier or just easier to do. So then, of course, this new digital technological regime allows or it fosters the transformation of the spectacle of torture. And unfortunately, again, here is the reality which we have to deal with in relation to Belarus. Where I would like to begin, as I said, I actually would like to begin with the very first question, because we understand that probably one of the major questions for many people who really hoped that the regime will be dismantled within few weeks or like a few months at least, but certainly before the new year, and then it didn't happen. And of course, it's a question for political analysts, for politicians, for ordinary people, why the regime still retains, why it didn't collapse, and it's not recognized as legitimate by anyone, and it's really it's quite clear that the majority of population, it also proved statistically, but the figures may vary, but still we understand that it's not the normal regime of the normal situation, and yet Lukashenko still holds the power. And for me, it seems to be really important to understand how did it happen and why. The response, of course, is in a very particular construction or in very particular configuration of this power, because because when we think of the dictatorship that was established in the mid of the 90s, you remember, of course, that Lukashenko came to power in 1994. So now we are exactly in the 27th year of his ruling. And for us, it's quite a serious question. How did he manage to stay for so long? Here, I would like to remind you that scholars who study quoting how modern dictators survive make a distinction between the totalitarian regimes that dominated in the 20th century and the modern dictatorships that continue to exist and even to strengthen nowadays in various parts of the world. The dictators, classical dictators such as Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, terrorized their citizens, killing or imprisoning thousands, and deliberately publicized their brutality to deter opposition, combining thus repression with indoctrination into ideologies that demanded devotion to the state. It was a quotation from the text by by Sergei Guriev and Daniel Treisman. However, in the 21st century, they constituted another softer type of authoritarianism embodied by Chavez Venezuela, Putin's Russia, Fujimori Peru, Muhammad Malaysia, Orban's Hungary, and so on. The leaders of these states come to power through elections, and in most cases, they keep the democratic facade. Sergei Guriev and Daniel Treisman call such regimes information autocracy and see their key element in the manipulation of information with the help of censored and co-opted media. Here, of course, I would like to make a comment because, first of all, it's certainly a very important. I mean, it's that any dictatorship or any type of autocracy, in particular information autocracy, it's about producing the content, I mean, producing the information, and about the channels of communication and the way how this information is manipulated, used, sent, and consumed. And in case of Lukashenko's dictatorship, both issues of communication and of information are quite important. Nevertheless, I would argue that Lukashenko's regime can be characterized as an old school tyranny. It's not information autocracy, and there are many reasons. I mean, it's questionable. I mean, it can be, of course, discussed, and not everybody probably would agree, because we see now how the regime, on the one hand, relies on old media and old technologies of communication and of governance, but on the other hand, of course, it tries to keep under control the alternative channels of communication, and quite often it is done through the digital instruments. One book probably would be also important to mention here. You might know it, or maybe not, but before 2020, there were different studies of the types of Belarusian authoritarianism, and I find very useful the concept of Matthew Fryer, who published a book in 2019 under the title Belarus under Lukashenko, Adoptive Authoritarianism. And like, if to summarize just one thesis, the main idea of this book was to show that Lukashenko's regime had been really adoptive, and it was quite flexible, adjusting itself to different circumstances, geopolitical developments, and so on and so forth. So again, here it's interesting to see how the degradation of this authoritarian, of this adoptive authoritarianism, because after this 26 years of adjustment to the circumstances, the regime became, the system actually is unable to cope with all of these challenges, even if it pretends that the situation is under control. So why do I think that it's an old school tyranny, even though it might have some features of so-called adoptive authoritarianism? Belarusian authoritarianism rests on the well-coordinated interaction of repressive and ideological state apparatuses. And this system was built long ago, and the mechanisms of its functioning have been improved and cemented during the long period of Lukashenko's rule. I didn't think about it in autumn, but with the time being, I mean, throughout all of these months that have passed, I was actually quite surprised to observe how strong is this ideological system, because till certain moment, just it seemed to be so ridiculous, but we understand that, and I will tell about it a little bit more, how this interaction takes place. This is just a comment concerning why do I think that we have to understand how this regime got consolidated and why it is such as it is. You probably remember that one of the, I mean, when we think of this combination of the methods of repressive and ideological state apparatuses, it probably would be would be helpful to provide at least some definitions. I'm not going, of course, to provide here the detailed analysis of a concept which is really well known, but it might not be known for some or for everyone. So that's why I will explain it briefly. So by describing the mechanisms of functioning of the state machine in Belarus, I find it useful to evoke some of the key theses from the well-known text by French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, who published in 1970. He published a text which had been later it proved actually to be historically important, and it is very often quoted, and it was called Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Notes Towards an Investigation. What Althusser writes about in this text, he makes a distinction between two types of state apparatuses, repressive state apparatus and ideological state apparatuses. The repressive state apparatus is constituted by the government, the army, the police, the courts, the prisons, etc. Repressive means that the state apparatus functions by violence. Also repression, administrative repression, may take non-physical forms of repression. I underline this and I quote it from Althusser because indeed here again we can just project these ideas and can consider the way how the repressive machine of the Belarusian system, how it works now. It's indeed the state repressive apparatuses use all types of violence, so both symbolic and physical. It's administrative and military. So it's physical, non-physical forms of repression. So it really provides us a lot of examples of how these types of repressions are joined. We understand that there is a state-sanctioned violence in the streets and in the prisons, detention of people under trumped-up administrative and criminal charges, sentencing in the courts, and we are not surprised anymore that riot policemen act as witnesses and victims, depending on the case, even if they themselves were the killers, as in case of Gennady Shutov, who was killed in Brest in August. Then we also see, and it was employed during all of the last months, how economic and tax pressure on politically active citizens was used, and direct interference into the banking sector, and so on and so forth. So, of course, in the system of fines for everything. And now it's, again, it might sound anecdotal, but it's not. Even if you want to leave the country, you have to pay to the state. So that was introduced by the decree of Lukashenko, I think in November, when it was announced that Belarusians can leave the country and cross the border on the cars only once per 6 months, but even for that they have to pay. The work of ideological state apparatuses is usually less visible and organized in a more complex way because repressive state apparatuses act as a single body, whereas ideological state apparatuses are constituted by an array of social institutions, religious, educational, family, legal, political, communication, cultural, and so on. And formally, they are not supposed to be part of the state. If repressive state apparatus functions by violence, the ideological state apparatuses function by ideology. They use methods other than physical violence to achieve the same objectives as RCA, repressive state apparatuses. In democratic societies, these multiple institutions produce different political realities and translate different ideologies. However, in totalitarian states, such as the case of Belarus, all ideological state apparatuses are subordinated in one way or another to the dominant ideology and reinforce the control of the repressive state apparatus. In Belarus, the regime switched onto the formation of ideological state apparatuses in the very beginning of 2000s. This process, the process of their consolidation, took several years. And I would say that what we are observing today had been already built and organized and institutionalized at least by the mid of 2000. Through which institutionalized forms it has been done. I would mention here just some of the key elements of this state system. Of course, it was the creation of a pro-government party. No one, of course, would recall what this party is about, but still it was created in 2007 and it was called Belarus. Much more important was the creation of the youth organization, such as the Belarusian Republican Union of Youth, BRSM. It was created in 2002. Then the next step was the elaboration of the main principles of Belarusian state ideology. So it's published in the diversity of pseudo-academic text and in particular through the form of handbooks. So if some of you probably who visited Belarusian bookshops and if you go to the shelves with academic books, you would definitely find like 3, 4, 5 different types of handbooks on state ideology. Sounds completely scandalous, I mean, impossible to imagine, but that's what was introduced already like 15 years ago at least. Then, and of course, one of the inherent feature of this institutionalization was the introduction of courses on state ideology in all universities. But what we see now and what became even more important, it's not how the ideological coverage or what kind of ideological program, let's say, had been introduced after the election day. In fact, there is, it seems to be now that it's all about the memory of the Second World War and the ban of white, red, white symbolics. But it's not about the content. Now it's more about the human resources and about the work of so-called of the network of professional ideologists. Besides Althusser, in this text which I mentioned, he mentions also professional ideologists, and he says, describing their mode of functioning, that they act by blackmail and demagogy. It's exactly what we can say about the Belarusian ideologists, because now the departments of ideological control and people who work on the salary for this, I mean, fulfilling this duty of ideological control, they are not only at every municipality, but in all universities, in state plants, in factories, and so on. I don't remember now the exact figure, but it's actually very, very extended network, so to speak. So many people are involved as professional ideologists into the state control over the people. Yeah, of course, part of this landscape in which the state ideological apparatus could operate so successfully, it was the closing of private higher educational institutions, higher educational, because secondary educational institutions are still at place. Also, the conditions for them are also becoming increasingly more difficult. then also the conducting of information hours in schools and military divisions and so on. And so actually it means that here we have the system which might not be visible to the to people who follow the events in Belarus through the foreign media, let's say, and those who do not who are not familiar with the situation inside. But we should understand that that Belarusian authoritarianism created an extensive network of ideological apparatuses. They all closely interact with each other and are controlled by the power vertical. And of course, nonetheless, also important. And here again, I'm not going to describe it in detail. So it is a very interesting moment in Althusser's concept. It's how ideology works. According to Althusser, in order to ensure the subordination of individuals to the established social order, they have to be transformed into subjects. I'll say later about it. And this is done through interpellation of concrete individuals as concrete subjects. Once the individual being held by the authorities, like, hey, you there, and once the individual recognizes himself or herself as the one to whom the hailing is addressed, then she or he becomes subjugated to the ideology. And here, if we think of this situation in retrospect and what was going on in Belarus already in the summer and the late spring of 2020, we understand that for many years, actually, and in particular, this famous Lukashenko "ты," when he addresses like anyone as if it was someone whom he knows very well, and he is not using plural "вы," but he uses only "ты," which becomes a kind of completely personal and almost like intimate form of address, of appeal. It's certainly the way of, without knowing this word and as political animal, I think he just simply would really use these methods of interpellation when the power regime interpellates the concrete individuals. Hey, you, such, and so on and so forth. And what is this modality of communication? What is the modality of communication between the agents of power and the subjects? Firstly, it should be noted that the effective functioning of the power vertical does not leave a room for the dialogue or the communication on equal foot. All messages from the top to the bottom in such systems as totalitarian regimes and autocracies and so on, all messages from the top to the bottom are transmitted as orders in a commanding tone. This model of one-way communication is most characteristic for the penitentiary system and the military structures. However, in Belarus, this has become a rule for all spheres of governance and the functioning of public institutions. The failure to comply with orders or the improper performance of the decision entails punishment, such as the removal from the office, be it minister's office or the secondary school director, and so on and so forth. And actually, again, here there are so many examples and so many documents that were published by Telegram channels, just the pictures of different types of orders, when it's clear that there is a kind of paranoia and fear of people who are who were the addresses, who were supposed to be responsible for the implementation of these orders coming from the top, and in order to, and it's clear that there is a kind of servitude volontaire, something like they have to perform even better than they are supposed to. But that's precisely because this way of communication, this, as I said, from top to bottom, one-way communication and the language of order is clearly the only mode of communication that this regime can rely on. Such mode of communication entails also a particular language. The analysis of the language of power in contemporary Belarus deserves a separate study. Here, I would only make a few comments in order to make my argument more grounded. Language is a very efficient, effective means of indoctrinating. It does not require the involvement of repressive apparatuses. In fact, it's a cheap instrument, let's say. It costs almost nothing. But on the other contrary, so it doesn't require the involvement of repressive apparatus, but what language does, it supports and reinforces it. And and here I would like to recall the famous text by German philologist Viktor Klemperer, who published his famous book on the on the language of on LT, the language of the Third Reich. It was published, I think, in 1947. And what he did as a philologist, we see now also that our philologists and literary critics do it, also establishing this particular linkage between totalitarian regime and the particular type of discourse. It's not only about vocabulary, but also about the way how the words are connected to each other, and the play of connotations, and the tonality and modality, the emotive functions and the modality of communicative tools that are used. So actually, Viktor Klemperer, in his philologist notes, he was just describing how fascism became part, how Nazi ideology was penetrating into all spheres of life. And nowadays, we mostly speak of this kind of totalitarian vocabulary. We are not speaking of it because it doesn't really it's not so common, but in Belarus now it's definitely much more than the language of hatred, the speech, the hate speech. It's the hate speech which actually is a product of totalitarian society, of totalitarian regime. And there are many really interesting aspects, but I mentioned Viktor Klemperer because I really think that this language of power, all together with the tools of communication, it's one of the ways of understanding how this system continues to work, and why all of the elements of this system support and reinforce each other. Furthermore, I mentioned already that it's this study of the philology of our misfortune, as Klemperer called it, would be interesting for the analysis of relations between words and scenes, signs and their reference that are characteristic for the language of power, and of the rhetoric devices and vocabulary used by Lukashenko in his public speeches. And there are, of course, many unwritten rules of communication between officials and the president, between authorities and citizens, the metaphors, cliches, pronouns used in the communication, and so on and so forth. So actually, this is just to say that we are speaking now about the ideological state apparatuses and how they work. And as I said, language of hatred, whose offensive and indecent rhetoric permeates all levels of the power vertical, is translated through the state media channels. I think that for distant observers who suddenly would start watching Belarusian TV, and in particular the Belarusian TV hysteria of last year, it would be just unimaginable how such a language modality can be, and such lexics, such vocabulary can be used by the state media at all. But nevertheless, we understand, again, through the system of physical, non-physical repressions and violence, that language here plays a key role in the implementation of symbolic violence. In today's Belarus, it's also quite obvious that there are multiple divides. It's not only digital divides between the opponents of regime and its adherents, but there are also linguistic and cultural divides. And I think much has been already written and said on this. It is quite obvious. Sometimes media actually provide quite interesting just comparing two realities, two pictures of realities provided by state-controlled media and by the independent media, and it really looks schizophrenic. So it's just like two different realities in which people live. And these two worlds become even, they probably were not so obvious before August of 2020, but since then the divergence has been only growing. And and here it's something that Brodsky, actually Vailin Genis, who published really great book on the Soviet 60s, they were speaking of inakomyslia, like the different thought that reveals itself in the different language. So inakomyslia как инакословие. And here what comes to the forefront, it's not only the question of national language, but also the linguistic, but even more the linguistic divide with all this subtle context between the opponents of regime and his supporters. It's again here, I would be really, we can also discuss it, how the particular language of resistance shaped by the protest culture evolved. And it's, at least it's obvious that it is characterized by the very reflexive attitude towards the language as a tool of communication. And here, just what this theme of the language and of the discursive features of state ideological apparatuses, why it is important, it's because speaking of how this system, where the system actually failed, and it failed precisely in the situation of interpellation. The development of events in Belarus during last months, during last 9-10 months, or probably even starting from the May of 2020, it really showed that the wrong call might cause the misinterpellation. The Belarusian citizens did not recognize and do not recognize themselves in the interpellation of power regime. And these practices of those rituals of ideological recognition, they do not work anymore. So Belarusians belonging to different social groups, and when each of these groups, and there are actually the particular names or particular forms of address that were used by Lukashenko, it's not only the famous проститутки, наркоманы, тунеядцы, яйцеголовые, and so on. So it's these forms of addressing IT specialists, women, students, doctors, etc. They do not work anymore, and these rituals of ideological recognition failed. So Belarusians demand a different kind of political subjectivity and not willing to be subjected to this regime. I'm sorry that I'm terribly behind the time, but Maxim, how much time do I have? Because I was supposed to speak of the society of control.
I think you can have 15 minutes. It's absolutely okay.
Okay, very good. So let me now proceed to this question of why do I think that we are dealing here with the old style dictatorship. Again, few details or some issues are not obvious for the external observers, and one of them concerns the importance or the role of the state TV. Again, Althusser wrote about when he wrote about the dominant ideology, he meant that schools and media play the most important role in the consolidation of dominant ideology. And what was happening in Belarus during all of these years of Lukashenko's ruling is that Belarusian regime has an unlimited monopoly on the circulation of information in old media, in printed media, radio, and television. And that's why they struggle now against bloggers, against YouTube bloggers, and against administrators of Telegram channels, against anyone who can hold a different, uncontrollable channel of communication for spreading a different type of information. The struggle now is like the most important for the regime. Because indeed, it's just all of these sources of alternative communication and information, they made almost impossible the work of state ideological apparatuses in the way as they functioned before. Because if you, for instance, if the state was holding in full control any message that was transmitted through radio or TV, because all 5 TV channels in Belarus, their state owned. And so, of course, it meant that the situation with the power vertical, with the vertical of professional ideologies, with the vertical and full control of all state owned media channels and media resources. So now you see how the system actually really was consolidated and how it functioned. So it's this kind of monolithic foundation or the monolithic building of the regime was able to adopt or to adjust to the circumstances until the moment when new media, digital technologies actually have changed it all. And the state, which constantly blocked access to independent information sources, you probably know that the new list of blocked media resources, plus, of course, the whole list of so-called extremist Telegram channels, this list have been created, I mean, they have been kind of popped up in autumn. Now I think this list already includes more than 70 media resources, and the list of extremist Telegram channels is also being renewed almost like every week. So it's not only like blocking access to these resources. Another less visible but even nonetheless efficient way of punishing independent media, it's depriving them of financial resources, for instance, through regulation on the advertising market. And and now we also see, and not only now, but throughout all of the last months, that regime also made it impossible for some newspapers, including regional newspapers, to print. And the regime blocks print runs and distribution through kiosks. So this had been the rule of this type of control and this type of prohibition and this type of ban and blocking access throughout all of the years of Lukashenko's rule. But during recent months and weeks, and during last year, or maybe even 2 years, we could have observed two parallel processes. On the one hand, the scale of pressure on the media, because of course the regime, Lukashenko, still wanted and believed that it's possible to keep the reality, the picture of reality under control, to produce the right picture of his reality. But altogether with the scale of repression on the media, we also saw how the new Telegram culture and the Telegram culture in particular, how these new digital communities were were developing around alternative sources of information and communication. And so these models that worked for several decades, at least from the beginning of Lukashenko's ruling, it really doesn't work anymore. And this, even so right now, it's probably reached its highest peak, maybe not highest. We still understand that there are situations gets worse and more absurd almost every day. But still, it's quite difficult to imagine how these repressions against all media, independent alternative media, and including Telegram channels in particular, and Telegram communities, how this can be taken under control. There is no way, of course. Yeah, so about television, before I have here like really quite a lot to say, because it has to do also with the situations that was particularly important in August, September of last year. You remember, of course, that for 3 days of terror, there was no internet, and the results of the victory of Lukashenko with 80%, they were announced, of course, through state media. And during those 3 days of terror, TV clearly produced its own picture of reality, and it was a kind of the magical world of through the looking glass. No mention of what was going on in the streets and in the election committees. And the Soviet practice of reading between the lines was brought back from oblivion when Belarusians could not find any information in the state media, and they started to interpret different messages, let's say, of TV series. Right now, very similar practice of reading in between the lines unfortunately is being also back in the prisons, because you probably know that the majority and the people who are detained by the regime, they have very limited sources of information. And actually what is imposed to them, it's on the very loud sound, TV, state TV and radio. And so this kind of information blockade for imprisoned people, it's also one of the types of contemporary tortures that are used by this regime. So there is a lot to say, but as I said, that it's really it's really important to imagine how this union of the old media and the old techniques of penance and control and torturing, how they all work together. And I would like to show here you some of the one of the recent I mean, it's not new, but when you see what I'm going to show, you will probably recall this, and you might have seen it. You probably know that the Belarus state TV was accused in the involvement in torture, and I'm even surprised that it happened only recently, because this spectacle of torture, as I said, had been which till certain moment, till summer 2020, was mostly perceived by Belarusians as something that was like from Kadyrov's Chechnya, but then it just became almost a kind of everyday practice. Detained people are being interrogated in the police detachments. Quite often, this altogether with the protocols, there is also video shooting. And what people are, detained people are supposed to do, either they agree themselves just in order to avoid the physical violence, or if there was already a physical violence, then simply they have no other means as to save their lives and to save their health and to say for the camera, they know, of course, that it will be transmitted through state TV channels, and so it means that actually the repressive state apparatus, as well as ideological state apparatuses such as media, how they both employ and combine and reinforce these forms of physical, non-physical violence, physical and symbolic violence. And that's really for democratic countries, that looks like a kind of barbarism, or something that would rather recall the Inquisition ages, the Middle Ages, and the techniques of Inquisition. But nevertheless, this happens these days, and this is exactly one of the instruments that is employed by Belarusian regime. So here is this very short video, and then probably we will proceed to the discussion. I deeply apologize that I didn't really manage to as I said in the beginning of my talk, that I'm not able to go through all of the points which I presented on my slides, but probably we'll just discuss some of the things in our later in the discussion. So here what you see, it's the recent application of the National Anti-Crisis Management that asked for investigation. It was related to the Eurovision contest, firstly to Eurovision contest, and then it developed further. And so you see that National Anti-Crisis Management, led by Pavel Latushka, they asked European Broadcasting Union to investigate materials revealing the involvement of the Belarusian state television and radio broadcasting service in torture. And this shameful and already as a kind of autonomous TV genre became also part of our televisual reality in Belarus. And so here is this video which National Anti-Crisis Management used when addressed the European Broadcasting Union. And this is just one of thousands of similar interrogations, thousands, and not really like dozens or not even 2 or 3 more. And this is a case of Nikolai Didok, who was arrested in November, and he was he's anarchist by his views, and he's a political scientist, and he had been famous for being really kind of active opponent of the regime for many years. And he also ran his Telegram channel. I was subscribed to it, and I must admit that it was absolutely great. And he also an author of books on the it's called The Color of the Parallel Reality. It's about his 5 years prison life in prison. In case if you find, I mean, you can buy and you can find this book, I would definitely recommend it. And so here is Nikolai Didok, and he was beaten, and then he, according to what I have read in the media, that he was not, I mean, it's not only that he was beaten, but also gas was spread to him, and he couldn't even open his eyes. So actually he agreed to speak in front of camera because otherwise he would not be allowed even to wash his eyes. And so here is this reality again, which I said that is propagated and that is considered by the regime probably to be the norm of life after election day. Sorry.
Год, 399.2. 2015 411.1. Какой субкультуре относишься? Отношусь к анархистскому движению. Какого года? 2003. Какие у вас цели, задачи? Цели, задачи, свержение государства, борьба с системой. Каналов администратора являешься? Не фоллоу, Дидок, пометь. Что эти каналы, какого рода контент, к чему призывается? Призывает к свержению режима, борьбе с правоохранительными органами. В том, что я сделал, я раскаиваюсь, больше так делать не буду. И всех призываю такого не делать. Люблю свою страну.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask you, do you see it or not? So you could see it. Good.
Судя по той видеозаписи, где Дидок под государственным флагом признается в любви своей стране, можно сделать вывод, что принципы этого человека не такие уж и непоколебимые. Потому что я сделал, я раскаиваюсь, больше так делать не буду. И всех призываю такого не делать. Люблю свою страну.
Shall I end? How shall I finish? Because we have to leave time for discussion. Unfortunately, I didn't really speak almost at all about the other side, but probably I wanted really to focus today on this relation between authoritarian regime of Lukashenko and the way how old media, analogous media, and how old totalitarian methods of control and discipline, how they work together. Because I just really think that it's important to understand to which not only is how digital divide actually split the Belarusian political scene and the Belarusian culture and the Belarusian society into two different parts, but also it's just, I mean, for me, really it was a question of how can we explain theoretically, historically, and so like to provide the analysis of the methods of the retaining of power. So probably here I would like to start, and all questions are welcome, and your comments. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry if I spoke for too long.